All right. Andreas, thank you so very much for making time for us today. You're such a good friend of this program of international education policy, and we're delighted that you're going to share with us the findings of this groundbreaking component of the PISA study in which you have assessed the global competency of students. And so as I turn it over to you, Andreas doesn't need introduction. He's the Director of Education and Skills at the OECD, and he really has transformed the global conversations about education by bringing some evidence so that we can have a little bit of honesty in these conversations, largely in the form of the studies that come from PISA and TALIS, but also from other research that he oversees, that his director conducts. So today he's going to talk to us about this most recent volume of the last administration of the PISA assessment that measures a number of global competencies. And as I turn it over to you, Andreas, perhaps I'd like to ask you to explain to us why 2 decades since PISA was first launched, exactly 20 years ago, you decided it was important to measure these new domains beyond scientific literacy, language ability, and mathematical literacy. Andreas, welcome. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Fernando, for hosting this and also for your great leadership in this field. You know, I think this idea of civic education, global competences really builds a lot on what you have done over so many years. And why did we include this in PISA? Because it's probably the most fundamental missing piece of education in the times in which we live. Can you appreciate different ways of thinking? Can you connect with people who, you know, work differently from you, who come from different cultures? And those are no longer at the margins of competency, but they're really the core of skills in the 21st century. They're also the antidote to the social media around us. You know, technology tends to, you know, connect you with people who think like you, who look like you, who work like you, and actually our capacity to think out of that box, to build that kind of bridging social capital has become so crucial. And if we can't make it visible, it's not going to change. You know, that's one of the lessons I really learned over the years of PISA, that at the end of the day, it's what we can observe that we can actually act on. And it's been, you can ask why didn't do that earlier, and I think we should have probably, but technology has also played part of a role in this. I think we just now have the kind of technological methods, the digital kind of assessment tools to do that well. I think that's part of the issue. So if I just share, you know, a couple of slides with you, just sort of to give you a sense of what this is about, the idea set in this. What did we actually define as global competency? The first thing we looked at is whether students actually understand the world around them, and not just the immediate world, but also the world, you know, in a broader sense. If you drink a cup of coffee in Boston, you understand that could have implications for, you know, workers on a plantation in, you know, Brazil. I think we take those things often for granted, but do we have awareness of this now? The second question is, again, you know, can we understand and appreciate a different perspective, different worldviews? Now, I think our societies are always most productive when we are capable of doing this. If you look at Europe in the Great Renaissance, or in the United States is also one of those examples. Now, where people from different cultures, different ways of thinking come together and create great things. Now, but this is something that we should regard not just as an attribute of the way of living, but actually as something that we can teach and learn, recognizing the perspective and behaviors and so on. And then, of course, the bigger question becomes, yeah, it's the passive knowledge of this is important, but can young people actually actively engage with people who are different from them? And that was sort of harder to assess, but equally important. And last but not least, are they willing to take action? You can know a lot, you can be able to do things about it, but will you take action? Will you mobilize your cognitive, social, and emotional resources? That's sort of the the most precious kind of dimension. So this is basically what global competency in PISA is about. And now you can ask, how do we actually measure it? Part of that we measured through tests where we could. We tested those aspects directly, but we also looked at many kind of attitudinal components through self-reports. And I can tell you, we worked a lot on those self-reports to make them cross-culturally comparable. That's always a challenge, but I do think we have done quite well on this. And then we collected lots of background data from school leaders, from teachers, from parents to triangulate, perspectives on this. You're going to see some examples of this. Here's a map of the countries that took part in this. Overall, we had 66 countries doing this. It's not as much as what we have in PISA typically. In PISA, we have over 80 countries, but it's a good group of countries as a start, and what is really a very innovative area of work. And so I think it's a very, very good resource for us to study those things. The first thing, of course, people ask, how well do people do on the cognitive components? And here you can just see sort of the list of the countries ranked by their scores. And you might think, oh, that looks quite similar to PISA. But actually, when you look at it a little bit more deeply, it is not. For example, when you calculate the global competency score conditional on reading and math and science, you can see Canada is doing well on PISA, but is doing even better on global competency. The same is true for Singapore. It's very interesting. Those education systems are very strong in reading, math, and science, but predicted on this, they're doing even better on global competency. Maybe not so much a surprise to you, but look at this. You take a country like Colombia, where actually students often struggle in reading, math, and science. But when you calculate their global competency predicted on that, they do really well. And again, those of you who are familiar with Colombia may understand why. Over the last 10, 15 years, this is a country that has invested very significantly in civic skills. After, the Civil War and all of the strife there, educators at local community central level have invested quite a lot in bringing people together. And you can see that is something that students in Colombia are quite capable of doing. On the other hand, you can take a country like Korea, high performer on PISA, but on the global competency assessment, conditionally on what they do in reading, math, and science, students struggle. They don't see much diversity around them. Like Korea is Korea. And you can see actually, so global competency has something to do, is correlated with reading, math, and science, but also tells a different story. And what's interesting is part of that story is explained by student attitudes, where students showed greater respect for people from other cultures. They did better on the test. Where they had more positive attitudes towards immigrants, they did better on the test. Where they showed greater cognitive resilience and adaptability. I'm open to change, I can, do things differently if I need to, and so on. They did better on global competency. Where they had a greater sense of self-efficacy regarding global issues. I can do something about, I can contribute to those things. They did better on the test. Where they were more aware, they were more able to take different perspectives. They did better on global competency. And that's actually held even after accounting for social background. I think that's really, really important, that actually this is not just an artifact of, you come from a wealthy family, you have all the world, open to you, and therefore you have better score points. No, even after accounting for gender, for immigrant background, for the students in schools, social and demographic profile, you get a very similar picture. The bars get a little bit shorter, I admit that, but more or less it's the same story. So what you can see here is that global competency is closely correlated with the attitudes that people have towards the world, towards other ways of thinking, towards other people. So let's look at those attitudes in more detail. I think that's where the story becomes so interesting. Let's start out with the first dimension. What do students know about the world? And you could say most students are quite familiar with issues around equality between men and women, with migration, with climate change, with causes of poverty, hunger, international conflicts, a little bit less, and then global health pandemics is the shortest part. Now, that probably would be very, very different now, after the COVID pandemic. But again, the idea of education is to prepare people for the future, not, to react to developments. And you can see that's where in the past we didn't pay that much attention to. There's also a lot of variability across countries. You can see, for example, in Hong Kong, Lithuania, Russian Federation, Ukraine, there's been quite a bit of awareness about the pandemic, whereas in Saudi Arabia, it's only a minority of students that have, some familiarity with it. So it's always, these things vary across countries. Now, but it was the area with shortest kind of bars. Now, gender difference. You can see in virtually every country, girls have higher awareness of global issues, whether it's climate change or migration. Girls at age 15 are typically more aware in virtually all countries for which you have comparative data. Consistent pattern. Think about it. Boys and girls sit in the same classroom, but still you can see there is greater sense of awareness. Another thing that is also important is that this is not just about school. Awareness comes from multiple sources. And we can see, for example, parents played a very, very important factor in this. Now, where parents were more aware of global issues, you could see in every country for which we have both data sources, the children were more aware of global issues. So you can see really how influential the environment for you is, even as a 15-year-old. You might think, well, 15-year-olds will probably disagree with anything their parents may say, but actually you can see the environment at home is quite influential, as is the school. And that's also explaining why social background is actually coming into those things. So that's very important. Now, that's awareness. Let's move to self-efficacy, what students believe they can do about this. You can see here students thinking that they can easily, discuss the different reasons why people become refugees. You can see 3/4 of students say yes. Explain why some countries suffer more from global climate change than others. Also, over 70% discuss the consequences of economic development on the environment, and so on. You can see most students in most countries feel quite comfortable to talk about those issues, but there is huge variability of this across countries. And that tells you something about curriculum implementation. In some countries, there is a very, very strong kind of perceived capability among students. In others, that is much less the case. And you can see also there is a gender pattern is much more even around this. Now you can see, for example, Scotland, where boys have much higher self-efficacy regarding those kinds of issues, whereas in Saudi Arabia or Albania, you can see huge kind of advantage of girls on that. So gender differences here are more, uneven. There are sort of different patterns in different countries. Now, that was the awareness, self-efficacy dimension, the kind of things that we could quite easily test. When it comes to the understanding and perspective taking, can you appreciate different worldviews and so on? That's where things got harder, where we used a mix of cognitive tests and then attitudinal metrics. And let's start with sort of the easiest aspect, cognitive adaptability. You can see, for example, I can change my behavior to meet the needs of new situations. You can see over 2/3 of students feel quite comfortable with this. I can deal with unusual situations. Whenever I encounter difficult situations with other people, I think of a way to resolve that situation, also close to 60%. I can easily adapt to a new culture. That is what students had a harder time with. Now you can see that's only about 50%. But also that, cognitive adaptability varies quite a lot across countries. And this is one of the charts where, the country results may surprise you. Now you can see, for example, high performers like Vietnam, Macau. Now, on PISA tests, they have stellar results. But when it comes to resilience, cognitive adaptability, openness to change, those countries, the students in those countries show quite great difficulty. On the other side, you take a country like Mexico or Turkey, where students are not doing well in kind of cognitive outcomes, but they are used to dealing and coping with kind of complex situations, difficult situations. Or Bosnia-Herzegovina, North Macedonia, these countries were in war a decade ago, 2 decades ago. Really difficult context, even today, socially, economically. But when it comes to resilience, students seem to be able to be, coping with this kind of uncertainty and volatility around them. And in the world in which we live, it's not just about sustainability, keeping the world in balance, but also, your capacity to live in an imbalanced world. So I think quite interesting outcomes. And as you see, some high-performing education systems really struggling with those kinds of things. This is also an area where one of the few areas where boys quite consistently did better than girls, at least in most countries. Now, this kind of resilience, adaptability is where you can see boys showing higher levels of adaptability. Now, moving on to perspective taking. I sometimes try to understand my friends better by imagining how things look from their perspective. Still, 2/3 of students think that's something that they can do well. I believe that there are 2 sides to every question, and I try to look at them both. I try to look at everybody's side of a disagreement before I make a decision, almost close to 60%, and so on. So you can see also there, at least on the surface, there is quite an openness to the perspectives of other students. Students' interest in learning about other cultures. This is where the bars get shorter. No? I want to learn how people live in different countries. Less than 60%. I'm interested in how people from various cultures see the world. Just over 50%. I want to learn more about the religions of the world. Just 40%. And again, a lot of variability across countries. You can see a country like, Turkey, where this is very well kind of established. Students do show a great interest in other cultures, whereas in the Slovak Republic, or Italy, or Hungary, or Germany, you can see actually that interest in other cultures is very limited among students. So, and this is basically an index that we constructed in this. So these averages that you can see across countries always hide a lot of variation by geography, by gender, by social background. What's interesting is that immigrant students tended to be much more interested in learning about other cultures. Maybe not so surprising for them, culture has been a defining paradigm of their past, of their kind of current situation. They probably have a better sense for this because they experience different cultures more. But it also seems to translate into a greater interest to learn about other cultures. It's also an area where, quite interestingly, girls do much better than boys. You can see in every country for which we had comparative data, you can see girls showing higher interest in learning about other cultures than boys. And once again, the parent factor is very, very prominent here. You can see where parents had greater interest in other cultures. We asked them the same question. You can see students tended to be more open about other cultures. So you can see actually, again, how the environment around yourself, for peers, we see the same, is actually quite influential. That brings me to a related question. To what extent were students open to immigrants? Now, if we ask, for example, you can see over 80% of students say immigrant children should have the same opportunities for education that other children in the country have. But, the numbers get smaller when you ask immigrants who live in the country for several years should have the opportunity to vote in elections or should have the opportunity to continue their own customs and life cycle. Now, that less kind of shorter numbers. But overall, I think the picture is quite positive. But once again, huge variability across countries. Now you can see countries like Portugal, like Canada, like Korea, now where actually students' attitudes towards immigrants tend to be quite positive. But look at Hungary, at the other end of the spectrum, where there is a very, very long kind of bar to the south. So there's a lot of variability on this. And once again, these data actually become more intuitive when you know a little bit about the kind of context of these countries. And also here, parents, very influential, where parents had more positive attitudes towards immigrants. students tended to have more positive attitudes towards immigrants. Now, I've shown you a lot of data about student attitudes. What's interesting is that they're not, in isolation. They're actually quite closely connected. The variable of perspective taking was a very strong predictor for many things, for respect for people from other cultures. Also and that respect for people from other cultures in turn was a predictor for the attitudes towards immigrants. And the respect for people from other cultures also was a predictor for cognitive resilience and adaptability. Perspective taking also influenced the interest in learning about other cultures, and then that in turn was connected with respect for people from other cultures. So you can see how those kind of different constructs actually interact and relate to each other. The causal mechanisms, I've painted the arrows in both ways. These data are cross-sectional. We cannot distill that from this, but at least you can see the inner relationship of those kinds of different variables. Let's move to the third area. To what extent are young people willing and able to engage with different cultures? Students' awareness of intercultural communication. When talking to people whose native language is different, my own, I listen carefully to what they say. If there's a problem with communication, I find ways around it by using gestures, explaining, writing, and so on. I explain things very carefully. For most students, that is sort of the dominant attitude. But once again, don't underestimate the variability across countries. Systems like Albania, like Korea, like Singapore, very prominent in this, while the Russian Federation, Slovak Republic, Morocco, you can see those bars actually going in the opposite direction. And also here, you can see that awareness of intercultural communication was very closely related to many of the other dimensions that I've just, highlighted. Now, this was about, what people say about attitudes. The question is, how people actually engage with other cultures. So we asked them, where did you make contacts with people from other countries? And the circle of friends is the most dominant source. That comes to family, but school as well. I thought actually these numbers were quite, school seems to be a very prominent place for people to meet people from other cultures, and then comes the neighborhood. And if you get to a country like Switzerland, for example, everyone is enrolled with other people in school. If you're in Vietnam or Brazil, it's more the exception. But basically, school is a very important source for people, 15-year-olds, to meet the diversity of our societies. And you're going to see actually how important this variable is in the next kind of section of my presentation. Now you can see, for example, where students had contact with people from other countries, they were generally more interested in learning about other cultures. And that's interesting because we also looked at curriculum design, curriculum implementation, and you can see it didn't matter. We couldn't distinguish, the fact whether something was embedded in the curriculum didn't matter that much as whether students had actual contact with people from other cultures. It's not just about passively learning about other cultures, it's really about having contact with people. You could see in virtually every country, even after accounting for social background, that was a strong predictor. Now, we also saw that, for example, contact with people from other countries was a predictor for positive attitudes towards immigrants. So where students had exposure to students from different cultural backgrounds, they typically were more open to students with an immigrant background. It seems when you look at all of this together, policies around global competencies are not very complex. It's really just about, providing opportunities for young people to experience the world. Language is another of those factors. Now, we surveyed actually to what extent students speak other languages, foreign languages, and you can see actually in some countries that is very common. You look to Latvia, to Hong Kong, to Singapore, now over 9 out of 10 15-year-olds speak at least 2 languages. In Korea and Mexico, it's rare. Now, but you can see actually, I was surprised by these numbers. I think in many countries, you can really see the vast majority of students now speak multiple languages. And you can also see here that's closely related to their parents, that the student bars are longer. So over generations that has improved, but you can see actually it's improved in line with what we see in the parent generation. Now, languages you can learn at home, you can learn at school. When you look at this just at school, there are only basically 3 countries, and it's all English-speaking countries, where the majority of students do not learn any language. Here, New Zealand, Australia, Scotland, but in the other countries, it's at least 1 and often 2 languages. So you can actually see schooling today making a big effort to introduce students to multiple language. What was interesting for us is that that's not just a tool to enable communication, but also you can see that students speaking 2 or more languages, they're more open to other ways of thinking, to other perspectives. Language being not just a tool to communicate with somebody, but also to understand, be open to new cultures. We also saw that, where students were speaking 2 or more languages, they had greater respect for people from other cultures. So again, it shows us that some of the things that we teach in school don't have only a direct instrumental value, foreign languages allowing you to travel, but actually they have a value that goes well beyond this. They make us, more open, more receptive to other ideas, other ways of thinking. Now, the last chapter is about student agency, what students do about things. And let me start here with, agency regarding global issues. Looking after the global environment is important to me. I think of myself as a world citizen. When I see the poor conditions that some people live in the world, I feel responsibility to do something. It is right to boycott companies that are known to provide poor workplace conditions for their employees. Now, that's all what the majority think. But, when it gets to agency, I can do something about the problems of the world. The bars get a lot shorter. And that's, I think, something that we need to work on. There is a great kind of desire among many young people to take a role, but there's often the perception that there is no space for that in their schooling system. It's something where you can see also girls having much greater agency than boys. That's quite interesting, I think, that basically you can see that, again, they sit in the same classroom, they experience the same learning environments, but girls feeling greater empowerment than boys in virtually every country for which we have comparative data. That agency, again, is not in isolation. You can see it's closely connected to awareness of intercultural communication, attitudes towards immigrants, interest in learning about other cultures, and then many other factors to a lesser extent. So let me move to the perhaps most interesting part. What is it actually that young people do about this? And here, this is a self-report. You can see I reduce the energy I use at home to protect the environment, close to 70% on average across countries. I keep myself informed about world events. I regularly read websites on international social issues, still almost half. I choose certain products for ethical or environmental reasons, even if they are a bit more expensive, now also almost 50%. So you can see actually the majority of students showing some level of engagement for world affairs. And once again, is quite closely predicted to what they see happening in their families at home. We've also looked at the number of actions relating to student attitudes. Students, basically the activities that students took, the kind of actions they took, were quite well predicted by many of the attitudes that I've discussed before. Students' interest in learning about other cultures was a big predictor for the activities that students did and the engagement they had. So how do students learn about other cultures? Where does this knowledge really come from? What is the role of school? You can see the report from school principals on this. Most principals say in most countries, yeah, in our school, students learn about different cultures' perspectives on historical and social events. So we teach something about it. That's basically what you hear from most schools in most countries. But when it comes actually to experiences, the bars get a lot shorter. Now, in our school, we actually celebrate festivities from other cultures. So students do not just hear about it in a lesson, but they experience it. You can see that is much more rarely happening. And you're going to see in a minute why this difference matters so much. The first bar has almost no relationship to any outcomes that we measure. The last bar is a very, very powerful predictor for what students, believe, what they do. And when it comes to the last bar, you can see overall it's quite short, but again, there's big variability around this. If you go to Singapore, you go to Panama, you go to Brazil, you can see actually celebrating festivities from other cultures is very common. If you go to Italy, if you go to Switzerland or Saudi Arabia, it's almost unheard of. So big variability about this. Student exchanges, that's a very expensive way. Now that's basically something, again, Singapore, Slovenia are countries that draw a lot on this, but in most countries that's much less affordable for students. So, but it's also a very powerful predictor for students' openness to the world. Just very briefly, we also survey teachers, and you can actually see that in many countries, teachers did some training in this field, but in most countries, it's just about 30–40% that actually got some training in multicultural teaching and multicultural setting. And most teachers actually said, we really need more of that. Particularly, in countries like Brazil, Chile, Korea, now you can see that their teachers have done something in this field, but you can see a majority of teachers in those countries said it's not enough. The challenges are greater than my capacities to actually do something about this. And the teachers' awareness of cultural issues is really, really important. Have a look at this. You can see where students' perception of discrimination at school. For example, that students think, my teachers have misconceptions about the history of some cultural groups. They say negative things about people from some cultural groups. They blame people of some cultural groups for problems. And you can see in some countries that's very prominent, like in Azerbaijan, Saudi Arabia, the Philippines, and so on. And interestingly, where students saw that teachers had these negative kind of attitudes, they themselves displayed negative attitudes to people from other cultures. So where students perceive their learning environment to be discriminating, you can see really there's a very powerful predictor for students themselves to have negative attitudes to students from other cultures or people from other cultures. So that really shows how cultural competence and cultural awareness among teachers is really, really important to create a climate of openness, of positive relationships to others. Students engaging in learning opportunities at school, you can see I learn about different cultures, I learn how to solve conflicts with other people, and so on. I participate in events celebrating cultural diversity. This is sort of the average of what students actually do to learn about other cultures at school. And then you have some countries, when you add it all up, where this is very prominent, like the Philippines, the Dominican Republic, Singapore, Indonesia, Thailand, and somewhere that is very rare, like Hungary, Slovenia, or France. So, and now to close the circle, I relate that back to the attitudes, and you can actually see the number of learning activities at school relate very strongly positively to students' attitudes. So once again, it's not so much what you listen to in a lesson, it's your activities that predict your interest in learning about other cultures, your awareness of global issues, your agency, your self-efficacy, your cognitive adaptability. And as you could see at the very beginning, those are also your best predictor for ultimately students' global competence as mirrored in the test. And I'll leave it there to have enough time for discussion. Thank you very much.
This was excellent, Andreas. Thank you very much. Let's follow the usual protocol. Raise your hands if you want to ask a question of Andreas, and I'll recognize you. So, Renata.
Thanks once again for presenting to this group. The findings are they're inspiring. So the question I have is basically at a historic period of time where there's a backlash to globalization, and where particularly in the OECD countries, there's a spirit of zero-sum societies, zero-sum economies. How do you position the importance of developing global competencies?
I think it's a good question, and I think we should perhaps distinguish, globalization as the relationship between nations, and globalization as, meeting your neighbor who is differently, and meeting someone who thinks differently from you, who's around you. And I do think, you can have, different views about trade, at least in the short term, but I do think this other aspect of global competency, can we live with people who are different from us? Can we, create value out of differences in views and opinions? And can we live democracy? I think those are aspects that I don't think we should put at disposition, even if we may disagree on, the globalization in the kind of economic sense. And I actually, in that sense, am quite positive, at least the young people seem to get that message. At least, that most young people's attitudes are positive on that. No? Maybe not as positive as you might wish. And the other point I want to make is, we should ask ourselves, what's cause and effect? You look, why are young people, why is the society in Hungary so negative towards, immigration and other things? Well, if that's the attitude of young people and older people, maybe that's the easy response that politicians take to this. So I think for me, it's just I think in the context in which we live, we need to redouble our efforts to create a world in which we will be able to live together, and not just between nations, but also within our society. Globalization is no longer something, for people who travel around the world. It's arrived at everybody's doorstep. You go to a supermarket, you find the world. You open your television, you find the world. You go into a classroom, you will find the world. And I think people who cannot navigate that diversity, I think are at a very significant disadvantage. And the last point I want to make to this, the answer seems so easy. Actually, it's not about, teaching very complicated things. It's about, doing things, experiencing, visiting, other cultures, meeting people from other contexts. It's not rocket science, really.
Thank you, Andreas. Do we have other questions? Aruj.
Thank you for presenting these findings. They're so insightful, especially given the projects we're doing in class on 21st century skills and competencies. I was wondering, for countries that have shown, a lack of inclination to include focus on these skills and respectfulness towards other cultures as part of their curriculum or extracurricular activities, what is the next step for the OECD or for people in general who want to lobby governments or national programs to take these results seriously and incorporate them meaningfully?
Yeah, this is a very difficult question. I think the one thing that encourages me, when we started with this work, we had very few countries actually opting to do this. And at some point, I wasn't even sure we would ever be able to do this. At the end, we had 66 countries, trying it, and despite the uncertainties. And so I think that's a good result. Most countries have endeavored to do this. The even better result is that many countries who didn't do it in the first round, when they actually saw the results and when the public saw those results, many politicians got asked, why are we not part of this? When we actually presented the framework for this global competency assessment in London, the British Prime Minister at that time said, this is nonsense. Global citizens are citizens of nowhere. We don't, need that kind of. Today, Britain is one of the countries that actually, sees what they are missing, really. And I think I am positive. I think it's the young generation. It's the future of the young generation, and I think they I'm from the results, I'm hopeful, that the attitudes that will be visible and that policymakers will take this to heart, even in countries that didn't do this in the first round. So I hope that we will be able to continue with this work and keep it on the map. And then, where we don't make those results visible, including the problematic results, very little is going to happen around this. And you used the word that I think is very dangerous, and that's to treat this as an extracurricular activity, because that's exactly the mindset of people in this. This is something that we sprinkle on top of math and science. Actually, that may be the heart of the curriculum of tomorrow, and I think that's a very important message that we need to get across with this, I hope.
Thanks, Andreas. In a moment, I'm going to bring it to Elisa, but I wanted to ask a question of my own, Andreas, because I imagine that the politics of negotiating whether to even ask global citizenship or what to ask are a little bit different than the politics of agreeing to measure science. For example, the United States, which has participated in every PISA assessment, chose not to participate on this component. And I also find, even within the community of people who are in favor of global citizenship, that so much energy is sometimes really spent, I'd say wasted, in deliberating, whether you should measure this or that, where the consequence is paralysis, is inaction. So I wonder if you can comment a little bit on your own experience in breaking through those hurdles and just getting on and doing something.
Yeah, it's been really difficult, and I must say, I was not sure for many months whether we would be able to do anything in this field, because basically the majority of OECD countries which run the program told us not to do this. That was the kind of context in which we had to do, and they basically gave us three reasons. This cannot be done scientifically, and you can always, make up lots of arguments why this is difficult. They say this shouldn't be done, like the British. They said basically, this is not the business of school. It's not the business of public policy. And there were some who said, well, the OECD is not about it. You are about, economic outcomes and not about those kind of civic outcomes. I must say, what I did, actually, I worked with a lot of civil society organizations. In fact, Harvard University is a good example. Your colleagues and you yourself were very instrumental in this, but others were too. I think really that was a very important source of both inspiration of what could be done in this field, but also to create momentum. Sometimes, when, governments read something in the media that is more influential, than you talk to them directly. And we used a lot of channels actually to mobilize a lot of voices on this, and create enough momentum that countries said, well, like the United States said, I may not do this, but I won't stop anybody else from doing it. And I think that was enough for us to create a coalition. And then, once we had gone through the first hurdle to do a test, the pilot results were available. They looked very promising. We could address all of the scientific claims. That's the first layer that you can actually show, yeah, you can actually do a decent job in measuring this. Once that was done, then we had a lot of countries actually jumping onto this and doing it. So, but it's difficult. I think that's part of the problem that we have in education, that there's sort of a layer of concrete in the education system that's very, very hard to break through from the bottom up and from the top down. And I think that we suffer from the same kind of issues.
I wonder if there isn't a fourth reason that people didn't express, but that maybe you should take as a compliment. And that is that PISA has become so visible that if PISA measures something, it's very hard to hide from it. The truth is the World Values Survey has been measuring some of these things for 60 years, but it's largely an exercise for academics. So if the World Values Survey tells you that there are a bunch of bigots in a country, that doesn't have the same effect that if the PISA study tells you you have a problem with bigotry in your country. But anyway, that's just speculation on my part. Elisa Guerra.
Thank you, professors, for such an engaging presentation. I'm sure that every person in this meeting, in this very international meeting, was taking in the results and also looking for their own countries in the picture. And I am elated to see that Mexico, at long last, has at least one indicator in which our country is strong, which is cognitive flexibility or resilience. But I also noticed that Mexico was one of the countries that did not engage in the full evaluation, but in the self-assessment or self-report. Could you expand a little bit more? What was the difference, and if the results are really comparable between countries? Thank you.
Yeah, you know, the story of Mexico was essentially that at the beginning, the government decided not to do that. But after the first test was out, there was a lot of interest in the government, and then they joined it. But it was too late to join the cognitive assessment because they couldn't adapt the instruments in time. So that was just a timing issue. I'm pretty sure that if we would do this again, Mexico would certainly be a good partner in this. They were very, very interested in the results. The Minister of Education really thought this was one of the most intriguing components that he had seen from PISA.
Thanks, Andreas. Shirley.
Thanks, Andreas. Just an extension of your comment around measurement. I mean, this feels like a really big step toward understanding how to measure this area of attitudes and competencies. And I'm interested to understand, were there any standout, on reflection, were there any standout gaps or areas that you think could be improved on in terms of some of the measurements that you took? And do you plan on making any tweaks to the battery of tests, or have you already done that within the pilot stage?
Yeah, actually, I think in the future we could build a lot of more of this into the direct assessment. I think meanwhile, technology has evolved so that we can include a lot of what we measured indirectly here directly. So we would go much further in the next assessment. The area where we did something in the pilot, but then decided not to pursue that in the main study were around values. And I also think that is a very, very important aspect of this. And I wish, we were worried, if we go ahead with something that is scientifically a little bit more kind of less robust, that it would drown the whole thing. So we decided not to do this for this first round. But in a second round, I do think that is a very important dimension where I found some of the most interesting results really. So that's a gap that I think we have to acknowledge, but one I think that we can do better in the next assessment.
Absolutely. Could I ask a follow-up question, please, Fernando?
Yeah, of course. Go ahead.
So thinking practically, I'm in South Africa, and we're thinking deeply and continuously about how to understand many of these different perspectives, and so have there been any learnings that the OECD could share with jurisdictions around how we could practically do some of this measurement at school level and at country level, and into sort of weave it into some of more of our formative assessments so that we can actually start to build it into the process of developing some of these attitudes and competencies?
Yeah, actually, I've been thinking about very similar lines to make this a kind of public domain document instrument that can be I think it's much more valuable than just looking at aggregate data. And I do think it's actually lends itself to this. I think almost in any kind of low stakes environment, you can deploy this instrument. The data are really, the cross-cultural reliability, validity has been assessed very carefully. The anchoring vignettes that we use for the scales, I think, are very robust. So I think you can actually use it very well at the school level. Also, I think the possibility to connect this data with data from teachers, from parents, contextual data from students, make it actually a rich source of reflection for schools. Now you can actually do a lot with this to actually not only see how your school performs, but also what is the context in which global competencies are learned and taught. So I think that's a really something that I'm not sure we will find the resources for doing this, but that we've had exactly the same discussion, how to make this a kind of public instrument.
Thank you. Voyun.
Hello, sir. Thank you so much for this really engaging presentation. Something I've been thinking about in terms of global competence is how so much funds are preserved on policing national borders, and it kind of leads to the dehumanization of many, especially of refugees, and that's an issue that's going to become magnified via climate change. I was wondering, to what extent do you think the culmination of successful global competencies would result in a world of open borders and people not holding on so much to the idea of a nation state that has strict lines on the ground?
That's a difficult question. I almost think that national identity and global competency are two sides of the same coin. I think the first moment when you start to think about your own language is when you learn a foreign language. That's the moment when this idea of grammar and language and linguistics really comes to your mind before everything has been natural to you. And I think the same is true with global competency. The moment you learn about other cultures, you reflect on your own culture, you reflect on the concept of culture. And I think the more people do that, the more they will see value in a kind of multicultural world. And the more they see value in a multicultural world, probably the more open they will be to work with people from other cultures. Whether this is going to result in open borders, I think there are lots of things at stake. But I think, for me, that is the very first step that we can take. If we do not, our natural reaction, unfortunately, as humans, we are born with bonding social capital. We like our family, we like our neighbors, we like people who are like us, look like us. So that's basically how nature created us. Now that's the tribal kind of character of us. And I think this kind of more bridging social capital is one that we have to work on. That is what education is about, to make people open to other ways of thinking, other ways of working, And I think the better we do on this, probably the more open people will be to live with people who are different from us. I think there are many, many steps towards open borders, but I think this, for me, is the very first step that you need to take. And without that, people will just, people who do not have a floor under their feet, they are going to build walls around them, socially, environmentally, wherever. So I don't know whether this global competency will decrease borders in the world. But I think without global competences, we're going to see more borders.
On that issue of how it is the interaction that allows you to see yourself from outside, the great German writer of the Enlightenment, Goethe, used to say, the person who speaks only one language sees the world with one eye. And I think it's about this need for understanding the other so you can finally understand yourself. Anyway, Catherine.
Thank you so much for coming. This has been just really wonderful, especially as Professor Reimers mentioned, we're all heavy in working on these papers on 21st century skills. I found the data around parental influence that you were just mentioning to be just really, really interesting. And Riley posed a good question earlier related to that as well. How do we, it's like, given that so many of the problems in our world are so urgent, how do we influence that parental-child relationship in such a way? Because it seems like this would take a few generations maybe to take hold, if that is the key or one of the key levers in increasing global competence.
Yeah, well, it can go both ways. I think actually children teach their parents a lot of things. And I think, I think you don't underestimate the influence that young people have on the society. Today, in many countries here in Europe, young people have done more for environmental awareness than, the many generations. So I think actually, what you can see here is a correlation. It doesn't mean that you have to wait for parents to change. No, I think actually that correlation can grow from both sides. No? But I think what is very clear is that we are talking about an ecosystem. No, we are not talking about what a teacher says in front of a whiteboard. Now, there are just many, many errors that you have to study to see how global competency evolves.
Thank you. I want to be respectful of Andreas' time, so we have 4 more minutes and 3 people who want to ask questions. So we'll just get to those and that'll be it. Claire.
Thank you so much. I'm very interested in the areas of multicultural and multilingual aspects of professional development. And this has also been my area of focus for my work in schools in Beijing. And I'm just very curious that with our like day-to-day practices, we realize that teachers do have awareness on these issues. However, that we lack the opportunities to be like systematically or formally supporting teachers to better support their students. So I'm wondering, like, I've seen your speeches in many like conferences here in China as well, and I'm curious, like, what do you see are the best recommendations for especially the Chinese context, maybe for the next 5 to 10 years for this area of professional development?
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, I think actually knowledge is important. You know, as a teacher, you need to know about other cultures. When you look to countries that do that really well, like in Canada, actually a teacher, and why are Canadian teachers so good in capitalizing on the cultural diversity of their classrooms, you know, embedding, you know, material from students from Pakistan, and it is because they know their cultures. And I think that's very important. As a teacher, you have to have you need to know your subject. You need to know how different students know that subject, but you also really need to know your students now. And I think their background and origin. And I think that's, very, very important. And as you could see from the data here, that's where most teachers express a very great need. You know, that is this cultural competence now, that the reality around them changes every day. They can't do anything about that. The classrooms get more diverse, and in the end, when they do not understand those differences, they, you know, react with, you know, classroom management techniques that actually do not address that problem. And I think that is, I think, a big, and so you actually run into open doors. You know, most teachers actually want to learn in that field. So I think if we gave better support for teachers, probably we could achieve a lot.
Jocelyn?
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing these really insightful results. One of the things that stuck with me was the results on, I guess, like self-efficacy and like self-reporting in general, particularly the slide on refugees earlier that you showed. And I guess there is a sense of perceived like capability or actual capability and what it means to discuss something, as opposed to like come in and echo like preconceived assumptions that these students have. So I guess my question is like, what are the ways in which this could be better ironed out or unpacked in the design of future experiments when students are saying how they believe they are comfortable in discussing issues of like refugees and all these other global issues?
Yeah, you know, actually, we looked into this in the design of the instruments. All of the questions were developed in cognitive laboratories. So we had actually very lengthy and very detailed interviews with young people about those issues. And we learned a lot through this. I think actually we could have never developed the kind of questions that we have now without taking that time and space in different cultures to actually talk with students. We didn't do any experiments about this. Now, I think that's another step, but actually we had very, very in-depth, for 1 year, we interviewed students in many countries about those questions to really understand how they interpret those questions, how they, you know, what was the best indicator for the construct that we wanted to measure. And that's basically what we did. But what you need to see is that in a way, it's still a very crude instrument. I think if you want to study these things in greater depths, you have to look for other methods, observational methods, and behavior kind of instruments that go well beyond what you can do in a study like PISA.
Andrea.
Hi, thank you so much, Andreas, for being here, and everybody. I work in family engagement, and so I wasn't able to look over the report in detail, but I was drawn to chapter 8, where the report discusses equity in providing learning opportunities for living together. So I'm wondering in future studies how we might define and measure how family engagement as opposed to family involvement influences educational outcomes for learners from all backgrounds, particularly in the question of equity.
Yeah, well, in PISA, we have only a simple survey that we give to parents where we actually try to mirror as many of the questions that we ask to students, just to see sort of how family behavior relates to student behavior. And it's actually one of the most powerful predictors. Now, the simple fact whether parents ask their students, how was school every day? Now, and this is not about, spending 3 hours of homework with your child or having an academic degree, simply showing your child that what they do in school matters to you. That had a greater influence than family income on learning outcomes. No? But the instruments that we have are really quite simple. But I just saw in the chat coming up a point about Maori education. I think that's actually an amazing example for how cultural competence can be taught and learned well. And I visited some of the Maori medium instruction schools, and I was actually really impressed. These were kids, 20, 30 years ago, they bitterly failed in the kind of mainstream schooling system. Once actually there was a system around them that recognized their culture, these students were extremely successful. It was all done by a minister of education who came from a Maori culture herself. Now, I think, but it's a very interesting example how we can solve that. It was not expensive. It was not difficult to do. All it was about is recognizing the identity of a specific group of people and building the same curriculum. They didn't adapt the curriculum. They had the same education goals. They adapted the learning environment, and very successfully so now.
Maria, you get to ask the last question.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. In my experience working in Colombia in a school, I have this struggle. So how can I teach my students to show respect to others different from if they don't live with them, like different kids from them? All the time they're around kids that are very much similar like them. They live the same, they look the same. So it's very hard for me to teach them how to respect others if they don't have the experience of being with others. So now in the current COVID crisis, it's been harder, even harder. So how can we help them to develop this without the experience, or the experience is just the ultimate way to do it?
Well, first of all, I should say that Colombia, as you could see, is quite doing well on this overall. Now, but my answer to your question is actually, it is the experience that counts. I think it's very difficult to teach from this data, whether something features in the intended curriculum or whether something is, teachers tell us that they teach this thing, that is not predictive on outcomes, but the simple fact whether students actually do have contact with people from other cultures, that is where the kind of better, attitudes and learning outcomes come from. So in short, I think it is very difficult to teach about this in theory without giving students those first-hand experiences. No? There may be ways that we have not captured, there may be teaching techniques that we cannot observe through PISA that will be very effective. But from what we can see is that neither the response from the school leader nor from the teacher predicted those learning outcomes, but the students' direct interaction. That was the predictor. But what I think you can do today with technology, actually you can connect people. This is what we can do today, which we couldn't do 20 years ago. You can actually use technology to bring people together in ways you couldn't do in the past. So I think we probably could bring more of the experiential component into education.
Andreas, let me thank you so much for taking time to share with us some of these very exciting findings. It's a wonderful way to conclude the semester and to actually take perspective on where we are in this pandemic and what kind of world we need to build after the pandemic. But also, let me thank you for your phenomenal leadership in using this kind of research and this information to cause people to think, people of all kinds, from teachers to governments to civil society organizations. So thank you on behalf of the entire International Education Policy Program. Thank you so very much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to share the session with you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Be well.
Hi, Fernando.